In the central German state of Thuringia is the town of Eisenach, with a modern population of 42,000 people, yet for much of its history, it had a population just a tenth of the size. Even so, the town has been overlooked by a medieval castle, the Wartburg, since the late 13th century, but the significance of this castle will not be found in its mighty walls, but in one of its brief inhabitants. In the early 16th century, it was within the halls of the Wartburg that Martin Luther translated the Bible from Greek into German, setting the foundation for the growing Protestant Reformation in the German language itself. Martin Luther would later proclaim that next to the Word of God, music deserves the highest praise. Over a century later, on March 31st, 1685, J.S. Bach was born in Eisenach, into a family with a long tradition of music. Orphaned at the age of 10, Bach left Eisenach to live with an older brother, an experienced organist. This began his career in the field of music, which would lead him to become one of the most well-known composers within the Western musical canon. Despite this, there is still much debate about Bach's music, his personal beliefs, and much of his life as a whole. Like many Baroque composers, Bach composed both secular and religious music. Bach was bound to the church through the patronage system, with his longest tenure being at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, rather than at the courts of dukes and kings, where many of the famous composers of the era resided. For instance, nearly 3/4 of his 1,000 compositions were written for use in worship. However, there is evidence that Bach himself found inspiration and meaning in his religious works. Lever, the general editor of the Yale Journal of Music and Religion, would go so far as to state that Bach's library at the time of his death resembled a pastor's working library, more than a library of a musician. Not unique to Bach, much of Germany was heavily influenced by Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. The divide from the Roman Catholic Church is most evident in the use of German, the vernacular, rather than Latin within the Church. Unlike other Protestant leaders such as Calvin, Luther embraced the use of music within worship. This led to the musical director of a church, or cantor, being tightly bound to the role as spiritual leader, with cantors being required to be knowledgeable of theological doctrine and catechisms. Bach, while a cantor in Leipzig, would have had similar obligations, demonstrating the level to which religion would have been in his daily life. Furthermore, Bach often took the melodies and text of Luther's hymns, along with the works of other church composers, as his cantus firmus, or fixed idea. This includes Martin Luther's famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," as well as another of Luther's works, "Preserve us, Lord, by your word." This latter hymn cements the divide between Catholics and Lutherans, as the text decries the Pope as murderous and willing to cast down Jesus Christ from his throne. Although the hymn was written in 1542, the text stayed popular for centuries afterward, with Bach's cantata being performed in 1755 at the 200th anniversary of the Peace of Augsburg, a pivotal event in Lutheran history, still retaining its belligerent lyrics. In fact, despite making hundreds of religious works in Latin comprise less than a dozen of known independent commissions, with the Mass in B minor being a significant exception, being written as a gift to the court of Dresden. Another aspect of Bach's music that is commonly debated is his use of numerological symbolism. There is very little direct evidence that Bach employs such symbolism, but possible examples can be found throughout Bach's work, both secular and religious. For instance, taking the letters of the name Bach and adding their corresponding numbers together results in the number 14. In the famous Haussmann painting of Bach, he's wearing a coat with 14 buttons, holding a piece from his 14 canon series, and the painting was produced for his admittance as the 14th member of the Society of Musical Sciences. Admittedly, these examples could be chalked up to coincidence, yet symbolism through numbers was so widespread in the Baroque era that Johann Schmidt wrote an entire book on the subject in 1736, listing the religious significance of different numbers and pitches. Using the process mentioned before, taking the sum of the letters in the word credo, which is I believe in Latin, results in the number 43, and in his credo movement of Mass in B minor, the word credo is repeated 43 times, and in both the St. John and St. Matthew Passions, the pitches of the phrase, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews," both result in 43, despite being set in different keys and having slightly different wording.
Dies ist Jesus, der Judenkönig, Jesus von Nazareth, der Judenkönig.
Bach's deliberate use of numbers is further supported by examples in the St. Matthew Passion, where the disciples ask Jesus, "Lord, is it I?" exactly 11 times, once for each disciple except Judas. And in his Magnificat, where the subject of the movement, every generation, is repeated 41 times, which is the number of generations between Abraham and Jesus as cited in the book of Matthew. As we have seen, Luther was a heavily influential figure not only in Bach's life and music, but also the German society at large. While Luther's contribution to the Protestant Reformation can be seen many ways, as either positive or negative, Luther's darkest legacy proves to be undeniable in his later years in life. In 1543, Luther penned a treatise titled On the Jews and Their Lies, calling for the burning of all synagogues and for labor camps to be established for Jews. Connections to modern events are inevitable and indeed even undeniable, as a defendant in the Nuremberg trial cited Luther in his defense. Bach's music did not escape criticism from the St. John Passion, with the narrative text derived specifically from the Lutheran Bible. The crowd calling for Jesus' execution are often simply referred to as the Jews, and they are often accompanied by highly discordant and bombastic music in stark contrast to the more tender chorales and arias, which make up much of the work.
Da sprachen die Juden zu ihm.
However, in contrast to many other Passion compositions of the time, such as those by Handel and Telemann, Bach uses these accompanying movements to shift the blame from the Jews onto the world as a whole and to the listener in specific. This can be seen in the chorale following Jesus' trial by the high priest, in which the chorus first asks, which is soon followed with, Bach, like all individuals, was multifaceted and nuanced, yet one of his most defining characteristics was his spirituality, as it permeated much of his musical works in addition to his personal life. Much of his religious beliefs and that of society around him were steeped in the consequences of Martin Luther's doctrines during the Protestant Reformation, for both good and ill. An artist's inspiration is often made manifest within their art, whether consciously or not, and it is important to recognize this to fully understand the implications and meaning of their art.